Hi class, so this video is going to cover section 2.2 on painting. Now, painting has been an art form for tens of thousands of years. Around 40,000 BCE, when man had evolved past the Neanderthal into the Homo sapiens stage, he also began to interpret and give meaning to his surroundings through the creation of art. And at this stage, there were really only engraving and paintings and some drawings, such as these. And these are from Pechmerle in France. And these paintings would have been created by blowing paint through tubes and then brushed on with brushes made from natural materials such as reeds and weeds. But we are going to move a little more forward in history and look at what we consider traditional types of materials to paint with, including encaustic, fresco, tempera, oil, watercolor, and gouache, and acrylic. So before we start talking about the various types of paint, let's talk about what paint is. So paint is composed of pigment suspended in a liquid binder that dries after it's been applied, or if left out too long, before it's applied. Pigments have been extracted from minerals, soils, and plants, although now they can be produced synthetically. And the binder is a substance that makes the pigments adhere to a surface. So this affects not only the product's final appearance, but also how it's applied. And paint types are really defined by their binders. And so that's how we're going to explore the world of paints. So let's begin with encaustic. Now, encaustic is a pigment mixed with hot wax and resin, so wax would be the binder in this case. And it's a semi-transparent medium, and it's usually applied with brushes, palette knives, or rags, but it can be poured on as well. Excuse me. When it's hot, the paint can be brushed on easily, and then it cools. As it cools, the paint hardens. And so sometimes after the painting's complete, there is a final burning in as a heat source is passed close to the top of the painting, which really fuses the colors. The medium does require a stiff back support, such as wood, because it dries hard and it can crack. There's also a need to work quickly because as the wax cools, it tends to get harder to work with. And you can see the idea of that here in this portrait of a boy. At the very top of his head, around his head, and around the hair on the top of his head, excuse me, you can really see where there's heavy lines, and this shows that it was being painted as it was starting to cool. So this was kind of rushed in to make sure they could get it completely covered. Encaustic was used in the ancient world, in Greece, in Rome, and in Egypt, and the word encaustic actually comes from the Greek word for burning in. This is one of the oldest painting medias, and the portrait you see here is actually a Fayum mummy portrait, F-A-Y-U-M, and that's basically from the Fayum Oasis is why it's called that. It would have been placed over the face of the mummy, and at this time, Fayum was a thriving Roman province about 60 miles south of Cairo. So this would be an Egyptian figure, but you can tell he kind of has this Roman style clothing on him. And so this was during Rome's occupation of Egypt, which explains kind of this different style we have going on than what we would usually see in Egyptian art. It has held up remarkably well, which really is a testimony to the permanence of encaustic. Now this is a 6th century icon of Christ from the St. Catherine Monastery at Mount Sinai. Again, this is encaustic, and it's supposed to show the dual nature of Christ, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But if you really just look at the image here, kind of where you could start to see the lines on the previous portrait, you really can see the brush strokes here, which means this wasn't the hottest when it was being painted. So you can really see the lines in his robe in particular, and down on the sleeve, and as it wraps around him, you can really see the lines of where the wax had started to harden as they were working with it. So this is actually a very interesting image. It's really meant to show the dual nature of Christ as both human and God. And you can even see in his face, each side looks a little different. And on his right side, or the viewer's left, represents his heavenly half, and you see this very perfected image of his face and very smooth hair. And on his right, or on his left side, the other, it seems very worn, much more heavy. The hair is a little more disheveled. The cheek is a little more sunken in. Now, on the heavenly side, we see this holy blessing gesture, and the earthly side holds a scripture, which would have been read by those on earth, the earthly word of God in heaven. And so, again, while this is really interesting, this really does show us this longevity of encaustic, because again, this is 6th century. So think of how long this has actually survived in this amazing condition with these extremely bright colors. So this really is a big testament to the lasting impression of encaustic. Okay, let's move on to fresco. So fresco is when pigment is mixed with lime water and then applied to lime plaster that is either still wet or hardened and dry, excuse me. If it is still wet, it is called buon fresco, B-U-O-N, fresco, or true fresco. And then if it's dry, it's called fresco secco, or dry fresco. In buon fresco, the wet plaster actually absorbs the pigment and the painting literally becomes part of the wall. An artist can only plaster as much wall as can be painted before the plaster dries. Now, fresco secco, they can work in a larger area, but there is a chance that the fresco can crack and fall off in the future because it's not actually a part of the wall. Now, in this method, a section of what's already dried plaster is dampened and then paint is applied. So the damp plaster allows the pigment to absorb, but rather than fully a part of the wall, it's actually more of a skim layer. And this is one of the earliest examples of fresco method from Crete. This is from the Palace of Knossos, and then there's other sites that have this type of fresco as well. This is a bull leaping or bull sports that apparently was a very popular theme during this period. We have a number of figures here. We have one like in mid-vault, and then 2 others that seem to be helping to wrestle the bull. Now, apparently bull leaping was an activity of the ancient Minoans. There's an abundance of imagery from painting to sculpture that really represents this activity. It was believed to be part of some ritual, but because the Linear A language of this period has not been translated, there is no written accounts that are understandable of what the activity actually was, whether it was sport, ritual, initiation, or what. So, and one other thing to note on here that's interesting is Minoan art really follows the Egyptian style of depicting male subjects with dark skin and female subjects with light. So here you can see this is likely a team of the male who is on top of the back of the bull and the 2 female figures helping to wrangle the bull, participating in this particular activity. Also, if you look closely at this image, when we look at the fresco portion of it, the lighter colors are where it has been restored. You can see each of the sections that would have been worked on in the darker colors and in the bull. The outlines of those would have been sections they would have worked on while the plaster was still wet. Everything that sort of looks smooth and lighter colored is actually restoration work, which has been done multiple times over the last several centuries. So often keep that in mind when you see a fresco that looks a little bit off in colors and things. Most likely that's the result of some sort of restoration. Now, in the 18th century, many frescoes were discovered at Pompeii and Herculaneum, where they had been buried under volcanic ash since 79 CE during the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. Some of these were still life frescoes. This one's really interesting because it kind of has this idea of realism. And while this was absolutely horrible for the people that this happened to, it did basically seal these two cities, and so a lot of the art and objects that were kept intact there were almost like new when they were found in the 1700s. So this is a really interesting one. It's a still life, and you can kind of see where they were attempting to create depth in it. It's as if these things were sitting on a table, and there's even a blanket hanging on the wall behind it. Now, probably one of the most well-known fresco images is the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. And it is probably fair to say that no painting medium really requires such careful planning and physical labor as buon fresco. It can only be painted when it has the proper degree of dampness. So it takes a very long time, and the artist must plan it out almost inch by inch. And so again, this idea of pigment and water onto freshly applied plaster surface. Fresco is not mixed with a binder because the pigment is goes directly into the plaster. There is a chemical reaction that happens when you create plaster or for the fresco, and it makes the color extremely durable and very permanent. So it really becomes integrated into architecture by its very nature. And Michelangelo, of course, here uses buon fresco. The ceiling of the Sistine Chapel took him 4 years to complete, and he would stop at seams to help define working days. And so that's kind of how, as he broke it up, he could do a scene in a day and a scene in a section. So originally, this wasn't supposed to be quite as busy as it is. It was supposed to be the 12 apostles and the pendants, and the rest, or the little triangular pieces around the corners, and then the rest of it was just going to be these ornamental motifs. So Michelangelo gets the design from the Pope. He was very unhappy with this and just didn't feel like it gave it its due. So the Pope gave him license to create a new design, and this is what he develops. Now, the finished composition contains 9 stories from the book of Genesis. The first 3 panels are God as creator. The second 3 panels are Adam and Eve. And then the third panels are Noah and the flood. And overall, in the entire ceiling, there are more than 300 figures in the mural. And so this type of mural takes an extensive amount of planning. Again, 4 years to complete this thing. And because it was very hard to alter the fresco, there were lots of preliminary drawings that were done. And here you can see kind of this close-up as each of the figures, all of the movement is completely different. Every single figure is highly, highly individualized. They have their little label on the bottom of who it is. They have information regarding them. And so again, there's over 300 figures in this mural. And we always see the creation of Adam, so I thought I'd do something a little different. The creation of the sun and moon. Here God is creating the world. And again, you can really see the delineation between each image. So we have all of these figures that are on these little small pedestals that separate each of the scenes, each of the biblical scenes from one another. So again, these also define working days. Okay, let's move on to Raphael. And so I mentioned that preliminary drawings were done. This is his School of Athens, which we already have looked at, and it is almost as well known as the Sistine Chapel. It is also painted in the Vatican. It's currently in the Vatican Museums. And you can really see how the preliminary drawing transforms into the fresco with him. Raphael worked on a large number of cartoons for this, and when we think of cartoon, we think of, Scooby-Doo, Tom and Jerry, whatever. But a cartoon in this time would have been basically a preliminary drawing that was the same size as the finished image. So when we say cartoon, we're really talking about a preliminary drawing. And so the artist sketches it out to scale and then perforates it with these tiny little pinholes, and then they would put it on the wall and take a sack of charcoal dust and pat over it, which really transfers the drawing onto the wall in a dotted form. That way, since they've worked it out on paper, it's much easier to work on and to create once they're putting it onto the wall. And then the work could be done in plaster. And so this is our finished product, which we looked at a few sections ago in class already. And so this kind of gives you an idea of how all of this extensive planning actually took place. And again, the idea of preliminary drawings. Okay, let's move on to tempera. Now, tempera traditionally uses a binder of an egg. Other things can be used as well, like fat, milk emulsion, etc. But for the purposes of this class, we're going to stick to egg because that is the traditional binder for tempera. It works best when it's mixed for each painting, so non-premixed paint basically. It is very fast drying, so it's usually painted with short strokes and lends itself to careful detail, but it doesn't blend as well as oil. Tempera is very good at retaining its color, because often oil paint, which we'll talk about next, can yellow and darken with age, or I guess in a couple of them, but oil paint yellows and darkens with age, and tempera very much retains its original color. Tempera can have a rich glow, as you can see here in Botticelli's Primavera, or Spring. And here we see very typical Botticelli figures. They're very long, elongated, and graceful. And this was painted for one of the Medici family, possibly for the wedding. And it's filled with these allegorical figures, and it's been suggested that our figure in the middle is the bride that this was painted for, but she's also shown as Venus. And if you look close, she almost has a very virginal Mary sort of look to her as well. So Botticelli really liked these many layers of things, because again, this is Renaissance, so a lot of even our mythological figures tend to reference back to Christianity, and we'll talk about that a little more in the art history portion of this. But an allegory, which is basically a narrative in which an image stands for an abstract idea. So this is supposed to be Primavera. Our figure in the middle is supposed to be Spring. And we can look around at various figures. We have Venus, which is our main figure here, framed by trees and foliage. On the left would be the three Graces, and then next to them is Mars. But if you notice, he has his weapons put away. He's not really he's technically the god of war, but he's not really fighting at this time. This is spring. This is a happy renewal occasion. On the other side, we have this blue figure whisking away one of the nymphs, and the blue god is Zephyr, who's the god of wind, and he's abducting Chloris, who is a nymph associated with spring. And then we have the figure with all the flowers all over her dress is actually Flora, sewing flowers. And then we have the little putti or Eros overhead, shooting blindly to our figures, making everyone fall in love with this renewal in spring. So when you start looking at all of this, you start noticing all of the detail, and that's what you can get with tempera. Tempera holds its color, and it's very easy to make detail with. The detail in the tassels and the flowers everywhere and the fabric. Actually, the flowers in this painting I think almost every single one of them has been identified by their genus and species. So very, very detailed, very, very colorful in tempera. So tempera is actually used by contemporary artists as well, and we see that in Andrew Wyeth's Christina's World. Wyeth uses a little more subdued colors than we saw with Botticelli, and a much more subdued subject. This was a painting that he did. This is one of his most well-known paintings. He actually painted this for a neighbor who suffered from polio, The woman crawling through the grass was the artist's neighbor in Maine who, crippled by polio, was limited physically, but was by no means limited spiritually. And he also explained that the challenge to me was to do justice to her extraordinary conquest of a life most people would consider hopeless. So he kind of grabs this arid landscape and this idea of ruralness, the rural house, and these almost shacks that we're looking at, very great detail. If you start looking at the grass, you can see the individual blades of grass, the individual strands of hair on our figure, and lots of nuances of light and shadow. And this can be done with tempera. And I mean, if you start looking at, you can see the blades of straw, you can see single strands of her hair blowing in the wind as she seems to be looking toward her home, almost in this sort of lost, having to overcome lots and lots of challenges to even just get home at this point. So tempera is very good with color, it's very blendable, and it's pretty easy to work with as well. All right, oil paint. So artists began to use oil paint during the medieval period, but it really took off and spread throughout Europe during the 15th century. With oil paint, the oil is obviously a binder, particularly is linseed oil. And Vasari, who is an art historian, actually credits Van Eyck with the invention, but he didn't exactly invent it. He was very, very proficient with it and kind of really pushed it to its extremes, but he really didn't invent it. So let's look at this, which is Jan van Eyck, and this is from your book, I believe, and it's the Madonna of Chancellor Roland. Now, in this painting, you can really see the advantage of oils over tempera. There's this luminosity, it almost seems to glow. That can be seen completely across the work. The blended colors and subtle shading that really can be achieved by oils is completely unmatched by any media we've seen so far. The detail in the floor tiles, the robe of the Chancellor, this amazingly detailed crown that's being placed on Mary's head, all of it could really only be created in oil. The linseed oil is very slow to dry, so the many, many, many layers it takes to create all of this detail can be reworked as you go through it. So this is something that can be altered and changed during the process. It's not a put it on and you're done. So that's one of the reasons a lot of artists really like to work with oil. It is very slow drying, and which allows for lots and lots and lots of detail. Another Van Eyck, which is the painting The Man in the Red Turban, and this is likely a self-portrait of him, and he really uses light and shade in a subtle and dramatic way here. You can see the blending of the light on the man's face and how dark it becomes, even with just the slight amount of wrinkling and around the mouth and the eyes. I mean, it's beautiful, very, very heavily detailed. The face and headdress are really helped modeled by the light that falls from the left, and the viewer is really drawn to the image by the penetrating gaze of this man. And he would have built up the thin layers of color called glazes and really made it rich and kind of luminous, almost as if it was lit from within. And you can see one of the disadvantages that you get with oil paints, because again, this is from 1433, and you can see a lot of the cracking and things that has happened over the years from handling and moving around, and as it dries, it does sometimes crack. So that is one of the disadvantages of oil paints, but with all of the luminosity that you can get from it and all of the control that you can take with oil painting, it is still a preferred media for a large number of artists. Rembrandt also worked in oils. Another self-portrait here. Rembrandt did hundreds of self-portraits over his career, and he really liked to work in oil as well. I mentioned him with drawing, how much he was a prolific drawer. He really did understand oil paint as well and worked heavily in it. he knew that oil, it's much more versatile than tempera because it can be blended on the painting surface to kind of create this tones and hues of color while you're working on the surface. It doesn't have to be blended and then applied, which most other media will have to be done. Oils can deal with subtle changes in light and really achieve the most three-dimensional effects. It can be opaque or translucent depending on how much it's thinned, and oil paint's usually thinned with like turpentine oil, and if it's thinned, it can be thinned to a point where it almost becomes transparent, allowing colors that were layered underneath to really show through, or it can be applied thickly, much like we see here with Van Gogh. Now, we looked at the drawing for this a while ago, and this is his completed painting, Sower with Setting Sun. I guess in the previous section, we looked at the drawing. And while it's often hard to see the texture of a painting when you look at it, you know, Van Eyck and Rembrandt were both very smooth texture, or had some very smooth texture, not impasto. There's no impasto to it. They're very smooth surfaces. Van Gogh is the complete opposite. He works very, very heavy impasto or texture, and you can easily see the brush strokes with this really heavy impasto. It appears almost if there's a roughness of the painting, and the oil painting is relatively flexible when it's dry, so it allows for this impasto without it just immediately cracking. And art became much more portable because it wouldn't crack as quickly. All of a sudden, instead of transporting wooden panels, you could take a canvas off its stretch frame and roll it and send it somewhere, and they could re-stretch it. And so another benefit of oils, which you can see here, is the bright colors. And if you think about the tempera painting we looked at, they were very subtle and muted colors compared to what we see with oils. Now, they were very vivid colors overall, but as far as in comparison with oil paints, there really isn't one. Oil is much, much more vivid. Okay, let's move on to watercolor and gouache. And we'll look at watercolor and gouache together, as gouache is basically another form of watercolor. And so watercolor is a pigment with a water-soluble binder like gum arabic that's mixed with water to make it liquid enough to paint with, basically. It's usually transparent and can be done in washes or with very little paint that's mixed in and creates a subtle color across the surface. Gouache is essentially watercolor that's mixed with Chinese white chalk to make it opaque. So let's start with watercolor, and we looked at a Wyeth in tempera, and so now let's look at a Wyeth on watercolor. And here he really makes a good use of the medium, and he is an expert at creating suggested texture with watercolor. If you look at our ledge, these washes of color really kind of become rough. You can almost feel the texture even in this like washed on color that we see here. And this muddled idea of watercolor really shows up well in sort of this aged, craggy looking window ledge. And then this beautiful rendering of the apples, and you see all the various colors that you would get from an apple being hit by light here on the windowsill. And here we're going to go much further back in time and see Albrecht Dürer, who we'll talk about when we get to printmaking a lot more, uses watercolor and gouache to create the subtle color changes on the fur of his rabbit. So again, when you're really wanting kind of these blended colors and everything not to be perfect, watercolor actually works well because it does tend to blend. The colors, once they touch one another, they combine. And so this just kind of gives us the gouache is sort of this gray colors that you see here, the gray and the white. Okay, so let's finish up this section with a quick discussion on acrylic paint. So we've talked about the various binders. Well, acrylic is a pigment suspended in an acrylic polymer or a synthetic resin. Since I'm saying synthetic, it should be pretty obvious this was not used in the Renaissance, Baroque periods. This is a much newer form of paint, and it's only been around since about 1950. And okay, so since the acrylic is, or since the binder is transparent, with acrylic the colors really maintain a high degree of intensity. You can thin it with water, which is very convenient in the studio and much less toxic than turpentine, which must be used for oil paints. The disadvantage or advantage of acrylic is it dries very quickly, and it can be cleaned using water, but it's much less flexible than oil paint when it's dry, because acrylic paints, if you put it on too thick and you accidentally bend a paper that has it on it, it will crack and often fall off. So you kind of have to weigh its positives and negatives. You don't have as long to work with it because it does dry much more quickly. It can look like oil paint. It can look like tempera. So it does sort of have this identity crisis as far as very specifics. But in acrylic are, if you've been to even like Hobby Lobby and picked up craft paints for something, that's acrylic paint. Usually those type of acrylic paints are more heavily diluted, so they don't come out as thick, and they're also a little more translucent than if you get the artist version of acrylic, which has a lot more pigment versus the polymer resin. And so they can, while acrylic can look like others, it has a very clean edge and a flat quality. So when it dries, it's not going to be shiny, but every edge that you draw, it's not going to bleed, it's not going to move out. And so that's some of our main characteristics of acrylic: clean edges, flat quality, and it's blendable with water. You can see the advantage of acrylic here in Shimomura's Untitled from 1984. These flat colors laid next to one another, very much this comic book almost look to it, and the sort of graphic novel idea. And this works very well with acrylics because you can lay colors next to one another with this fast dry time without causing an issue. You'll notice there's no blending really. There's some shading and overlaying of colors. Again, very, very easy with acrylics due to this kind of fast drying nature and retaining its bright colors. The last artist we'll look at with painting is David Hockney. He is a prolific user of acrylics. He's considered one of the most well-known artists for working exclusively in acrylic. Again, this idea of clean lines. Here we do see some blending, within this painting, and it really lends itself to kind of this graphic minimalist approach that Hockney is very, very well known for. So that's going to wrap us up for painting, and we will continue on with section 2.3 on printmaking.